All right, Alex, you can go ahead and take it away.
Perfect. Thank you, Greg. And so, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. And thank you for being here for this new session of the seminar series, Being Singular. I'm Alessandro De Cesaris, and I'm co-hosting this seminar series with Gregory Scott Moss. And just to let you know what we've been doing so far, during the last sessions, we've been mostly dealing, I don't know if Greg agrees, we've been dealing with the question of the relationship between singularity and one, so to say. So we agreed that in order to understand what it means to be singular, we have to we have to compare this notion to other notions, which is the one, the individual, and et cetera, et cetera. And we've been discussing quite a lot about the relationship between the singular and the one. We've had many incredible guests. And the last time we had Saloni de Souza, who gave us a really beautiful presentation of the Parmenides by Plato. And today we are going to go a step further and introduce the French into the conversation, thanks to our new guest for today, Emmanuel Alloa from the University of Fribourg, in Switzerland, where I have the pleasure to work. He's professor of philosophy, of aesthetics and philosophy of art. He's a world-leading expert in phenomenology and media philosophy. And correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, his latest book, maybe his most renowned book in English, is Looking Through Images: A Phenomenology of Visual Media, which is a beautifully written attempt to rethink the way we think about images from a media philosophy viewpoint. But I believe the last thing you edited is the German version of Gilbert Simondon lectures about imagination and invention. So that's maybe more related to today's topic. And today the topic will be the problem of singularity and individuation in the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze and Gilbert Simondon. So, which is really a core contribution to the topic we are going to discuss during this seminar series. So, Emmanuel, thank you so much for your contribution, for having accepted to be with us, especially in these hot summer days. And many thanks to you all for being here. You have the floor. Thank you again. We are really excited to listen to your presentation.
Well, I would like to thank you both for setting up such a wonderful venue, and I would like to thank the audience to even be available at such a late point in the year on a hot day, engaging in some speculative exercises. I'm not sure this really helps to cool down our heads. Alessandro and Greg have invited me to join this research seminar on the topic of being singular. And I have to say, I was very honored that such experts on Hegelian ontology were thinking that I had anything relevant to contribute. And I was actually reading Alessandro's monumental study on the concept of singularity in Hegel that came out earlier this year in Italian only so far, but I hope there will be the results will be made available in some form or another in English too, because I think it's a crucial contribution to Hegelian studies, but also beyond to the topic of singularity. And I just realized how ill-equipped I am to sustain such highly elaborate discussions, both in historical and in contemporary perspectives, because this is, of course, what you have set up as a program. Now, as someone, you've announced it, Alessandro, coming from the background of aesthetics and philosophy of art, my first reaction was, well, of course, singularity is a given. Singularity must be a starting point, because whoever engages with an artwork, the encounter of the artwork is always a singular encounter. Artworks tend to resist any generalizing attempt to formalization or conceptualization. So singularity is, if you want, it's the 101 in aesthetics and philosophy of art. On the other hand, I also, at least peripherally, entertained some speculative interests, and Greg's and Alessandro's invitation worked as an incentive, spurring me to ponder over what I took to be the obviousness of any aesthetic thinking, that is, that it must work with singularities. So what do we mean then when we talk about being singular, or about singular being? Is there such a thing like a general way of being singular? That is, if we resort to the most natural grammar philosophers use, is there such a thing like singularity? And maybe I'd like to share some slides to support the few ideas I'd like to share with you today. All right. So I will refrain from answering this huge question, what does it mean to be a singularity? And I will rather start with some preliminary linguistic remarks. According to the Oxford Dictionary, singular has a rather stable and unequivocal meaning. It stands for noun or verb that refers to one person or thing. One could now easily imagine that singularity thus indicates the common condition of all singulars, its class or species. Similarly to analogous terms, civility is thus a common feature to everything that is civil, rarity of everything that is rare, and density of everything that is dense. So one might expect singularity to be defined by being one, number, and kind, by oneness or singleness. Yet if we look up the definition of the Oxford Dictionary provided for singularity, we come up with our first surprise. The first and general definition of what characterizes singularity is the following, I quote, "the quality of something that makes it unusual or strange." End of quote. This might be the first warning sign that the kind of being we are looking for is slightly different than other ones and can't be subsumed through the same procedures of generalization. If we continue the list of the further definitions provided by the dictionary, we find definitions from mathematics and physics, each time referring to some threshold or limit where a radical change of state takes place. So it says the mathematical point at which certain physical quantities reach infinite values, etc., etc. Goes on to explain that, for example, according to general relativity, the curvature of space-time becomes infinite in a black hole. In the Big Bang theory, the universe was born from a singularity in which the density and temperature of matter were infinite, etc., etc. I think for a general audience, the concept of singularity is probably much more related to such physical and astrophysical dimensions today, if not to some futurists who use it to designate a future point in time where human intelligence will be overtaken by machine intelligence. I will not delve into this now, but simply want to stress that in all these semantics, singularity indicates a point of rupture or of break where things start to behave differently and in unrecognizable ways. If my acquired English skills do not betray me altogether, native speakers are invited to correct me right away if I'm wrong on this. There's thus a major gap between singular and singularity. The unusual and strange character recognized in singularity is not to be found in the grammatics of the singular. It might be worth noting, and be it just to understand some of the reasons for the incredible productivity of some areas of contemporary philosophy that I will now turn to, that things are quite different in French. To a French speaker, to say of something that it is singulier may both refer to its existing only in the singular and thus not in the plural, but it may also refer to its being peculiar, strange, or even eerie. The French dictionary Littré, The French dictionary Littré features numerous examples from Montaigne, Descartes, and Voltaire through the 19th century, which testify that in French, singulier is very often that which deviates from the norm and generates surprise. Such linguistic background should be kept in mind when moving to the discussion a certain French debate entertained about singularity. One might even argue that a certain tradition associated with the pensée de la différence, a thinking of difference, and which is often meant to include authors such as Deleuze, Derrida, Foucault, Lyotard, Nancy, Badiou, or Agamben, if we want to include him in this French list, is in fact by and large a thinking of singularity. None of these have probably pushed the reflection on singularity. None of these has probably pushed the reflection on singularity as far as Jean-Luc Nancy in his opus magnum, Being Singular Plural, Être Singulier Pluriel. But also already in his early Communauté des œuvrés, the inoperative community, where he writes the following. The singular being is neither the nor the individual. There is a concept of the common being and of the individual. There is a generality of what is common and of the individual. There is neither of these for the singular being. There is no singular being. I think this passage is extremely instructive for this seminar topic. I think it explains why a certain tradition of this pensée de la différence has been quite skeptical of the attempts to counter any, let's call it bad universalism, through an insistence on individuality. The thinking of difference is not a thinking insisting on radical individuality. I think this should be taken as a starting point. So then what is it? For the sake of exhaustivity, I shall mention that after this interrupted quotation here, Nancy goes on to explain that there is, which is different, an essential singularity of being itself. So that's, of course, Nancy's project in his oeuvre, which he associates with Heideggerian finitude. And I will not follow him on this today, because my point is not to speak about Nancy, and I will certainly, I have to highlight this. Of course, I'm not pretending to give any unifying account of authors so diverse, but I'm just trying to understand why there has been such an interest in singularity and in the singulier in a given intellectual tradition. I've named some of the authors associated with it. I will explore another line of thinking today, which derives from altogether different intellectual genealogies than that of, let's say, Derrida and Jean-Luc Nancy, and yet strangely shares some strikingly analogous conclusions with Nancy, the metaphysical line of thought that runs through Gilbert Simondon and Gilles Deleuze, and has some forerunners, metaphysical and vitalist forerunners we might be talking about in a moment. So then, what are we talking about when singularities should not be thought of in terms of individuality? Because, as Nancy laid out, individuality is fundamentally in a situation of solidarity with universality. So basically, individuality is something that is on the same level as individuality, as universality, because it is the instantiation, the token of a universal being. What I'd like to develop here is an attempt to describe this in the following way. Singularity is not a matter of pedigree, it is a matter of degree. We have a traditional understanding of what individuality / singularity means in what, in a tradition, we could call onto-theology, where the Aristotelian categories are translated into a visual diagram as follows, and this is quite well known to everybody in the room, I believe, but just to recall this. So as you probably know, there was this 3rd century Syrian mathematician, logician named Porphyry, who translated Aristotle and his categories in particular into a systematized approach to the organization of thought in diagrams. And later on, this intellectual diagram was also visualized in what you see on the left. So that's a 16th century engraving on the tree, with the individual being at the roots. And on the right-hand side, you see an 18th century engraving of the Porphyrian tree, already mixed with theological elements. So this is Alexander Brunswick. It's Tractatus in Aristotelis Logicam, an engraving by Martin Prokes, kept at the Hungarian Franciscan Library. And what we see is basically the individual down there. So we see Saint John, we see Saint Peter, and they are associated with the individua, and ultimately and their descendants. So we have this idea of pedigree, in a sense of a descendants that is generated, of course, in the sense of a genealogy, but it's also descending from the top, the crown of the tree, where ultimately it's all summarized by the ens genus generalissimum. And of course, what is important here is the fundamental asymmetry, the non-symmetry. So the tree itself is presented as a symmetrical structure. It's a diagram based on symmetry, but inherently there is the specific difference, and the differenza specifica explains why the symmetry is actually an asymmetry. There is one a genus which is higher and the other one which is lower. So there is substance, accidents, there is sky, spirit, and plants, and stones, and animated, non-animated beings, living, non-living beings, rational, non-rational beings. So there is this internal hierarchy which we find in Western metaphysics. So what is presented as a symmetry is basically an asymmetry, a non-symmetry. And so we have these different elements intertwined, explaining why ultimately the individual is one, but it's also descending from the one. So there would be a lot to say here about the henological implications, even in the Aristotelian categories. As you know, there are different formulations within Aristotle's own categories. So is the individual the starting point, or is it the end point? But I will not venture into these things, just to say that we could summarize all this as a way of thinking the individual as something that is both at the root and that is both descending from the crown, that is both the lowest and the highest, because it is basically interchangeable. It's both the highest and the lowest, because the universal and the individual are not fundamentally at odds. I'll be happy to answer some questions about this. I will now move to an alternative account, which became important in modernity. So modernity has questioned this inherent hierarchy between, let's say, the rational, the non-rational, the human, the non-human, the living, the non-living, etc., by insisting on an inherently and fundamental equation of each and every thing. I'm just mentioning a few brief examples from aesthetic modernity. So if we take a painting by Jackson Pollock, we will find that the traditional distinction between the figurative space, that would the part of the space of the painting used to depict what is relevant, and the blank space is no longer given. So the blank space, which was only there to give a background to the figure. So figure and ground relationships are no longer valid. So the canvas of Jackson Pollock is structured by what we could call almost some form of metaphysical equality. It's the all over. So every single inch of the canvas is now potentially filled with color and is potentially relevant. If we take another example from the moving images, we could talk about chronophotography. So chronophotography has been introduced to solve a certain number of issues that were puzzles for painting, and chronophotography allowed to solve some of these puzzles, but also to depict things that were never seen before, to visualize events and dimension of reality never depicted before. So I've just used these labels. In modernity, everything counts evenly, and through seriality, everything is even through counting. This will become important. So the counting and equality somehow belong together. So it's a mathematization, also a distribution that is itself standard. So standardization, serializations are the prerequisites for this general equivalence. And just to say, I mean, this example I took from Edward Muybridge, the woman jumping, running straight, high jump, is included in Muybridge's book Animal Locomotion, which is, I think, already telling. So it's a book where human movement is side to side with, for example, the flight of a dove that will be decomposed. So this priority of the human, or even of the male human, is no longer given. So female a movement will be depicted in ways that were never accessible before to painting. This would be a scene that was never shown in classical painting, with this woman jumping. And the same thing we might say about the non-human. So basically, we could say it's the discovery of the any instant whatsoever. I'll come back to this in a moment. I will basically refer to the first pages of Gilles Deleuze's L'image mouvement. As you probably know, Gilles Deleuze in the early 80s, 83, 85, writes a 2-volume book about cinema, a highly dense diptych, which could be the object of a seminar of its own. I will not go into, but I will only refer to the starting point of what he does at the beginning of the first volume, called The Movement Image, L'image Mouvement. And what he does there is to say, well, basically, we have to go back to Bergson when we want to understand moving images. And Henri Bergson dismissed cinema, was very critical of cinema, because he said cinema misses life. And on the other hand, Deleuze, as you probably know, uses Bergson to counter Bergson. It's an anti-Bergsonian, Bergsonian move by saying there are elements in Bergson that help us to understand give us a different account of what the moving image, in particular cinema, is. Why am I saying this? Well, because I think it will be important to understand what singularity means in Deleuze, and it's probably a good entry point. There could be various ones, but I think it's the most accessible one to thinker himself, very, very technical and complex, and I chose this one today. So Deleuze discusses Bergson's thesis about cinema in Creative Evolution, l'évolution créatrice, insisting upon what Bergson sees as an effect of modern science. In treating time as an independent variable, time is turned into a static structure of regular intervals, whereby allowing the analytic decomposition of movement. Although it is one particular frame of Muybridge's Horses in Gallop that allowed to solve the old conundrum of whether and how all 4 legs of the horse are suspended when galloping, thus proving the painterly tradition, such as in Géricault's Derby of Epsom, 1821, you see it on the upper right corner. proving it wrong, this single frame is equal to all others and has no privileged position. Okay, so I think this is important. There's some form of eternity. This single frame is somehow privileged, if you wish, and at the same time, within the chronophotographic dispositif, which will also be used by cinema, we have this mechanical movement that creates a standardized interval and ultimately an analytic decomposition of movement. So we have to understand there's an absence of privilege, there's an absence of moments that would be somehow different from all others. This is the moment where Deleuze introduces one of his most crucial concepts. It is the concept of the singularité quelconque, but he does it in two steps. The first step is to introduce what he calls the any instant whatever. It's a very approximate translation of something that sounds less bulky in French than it might be in English. Instant quelconque, the instant, the moment whatever, the instant whatever, the any instant whatever. What's that supposed to mean? Deleuze says cinema and its mechanized device introduces a general equality, and the camera, writes Deleuze, appears as an exchange, or rather as a generalized equivalent of the movements of translation. And in this sense, cinema is the system which reproduces movement as a function of any instant whatsoever. So, instant quelconque, that is, as a function of equidistant instants, selected so as to create an impression of continuity. So there are two ways to read this. Bergson would say that's the illusion. It's the illusion of continuity, whereas, of course, cinema itself does not include movement. It's the Zeno's paradox, you know. So cinema, the single frame, will never reach the goal. On the other hand, and despite this illusion, there is something like the introduction of a general equivalence through the equidistant instance. So Deleuze says, in spite of the illusion, Bergson helps us to understand what this general equality means. That is, that every single instant is worth the same as all the other ones. So any instant may be picked. We are now slowly understanding why the critique of the first image of thinking, this image of thinking where the individual is somehow nothing but a token of a general type, of some sort of instantiation of a general category, of a general class or a general being. So the traditional logic of subsumption, where any individual could be subsumed under a more general being, is made problematic. Now, of course, if you have this absolute hospitality where all beings would be equal, you have another problem sneaking in. It's the problem of meaning. So where everything, each and everything is equal to each and every other thing, we have a logic of counting. So everything counts the same, but everything is only understood through counting. So what's the way out? And these are extremely dense pages. I would like to invite you, if you have the time, to read them again. It's really page 4, 5. It's these pages where Deleuze does millions of things within short paragraphs. So it's really worth unpacking everything that goes on there. I think he's now moving towards what he calls the whatever singularity, the singularité quelconque. Of course, it's an analysis of cinema as the pretext. It's analysis of the image of movement. And of course, it's all about the moving image. But basically, at the background, we have an ontological question. And we have to understand how we can reintroduce the issue of meaning, of expression within this general equivalence. I have chosen an artwork that to me illustrates wonderfully what we're engaging into. It's an artwork that Deleuze himself did not choose. And of course, you'd be surprised to find any reference to painting in a book on cinema, but I think it might be useful to illustrate my point. So there's an artwork from Futurism by Giacomo Balla, Girl Running on a Balcony, Bambina che corre su un balcone, from 1912, that will help me making my point here. There's a certain tradition that affirms the primacy of intensity over geometric extension. And this is where both Deleuze and Simondon are affiliated with. Besides its sharp critique of anything like a homogeneous and isotropic space, this tradition also insists on the fact that extensive qualities cannot be divided without changing their very nature. So I think this is really the point. So extensive qualities can be divided analytically, of course, but when they are divided, they change their very nature. Why is Giacomo Balla helpful here? There's an example kept, an artwork, a painting kept at the Galleria d'Arte Moderna in Milan. The painting contains an obvious reference to chronophotography, but it would be mistaken to see it as a direct transposition of it onto the painterly medium. What makes the painting dynamic lies not in the chronophotographic repetition that metrically divides the painting into successive snapshots, but rather in the bursting forth of color. At the level of the knees of the girl, I hope you see it, the level of the knees of the girl, the color encroaches onto the vertical bars and starts to spill out. So this is the moment where we see that the principle of segmentation, the principle of mechanical succession is somehow subverted by the very principle of color here, because color somehow seems to spread beyond these chronophotographic moments. And there's a new dynamics, there's a new thread, there's something there's an overflow that does not truly fit into this mechanical distribution. And of course, it draws our attention. So there's an element in this painting that is, if you wish, the whatever. So every single point counts as much as the other ones. And still, there is something that draws us in. I think the artwork might help to illustrate an idea that comes forth in Deleuze, and which, interestingly, he associates with a certain aesthetic modernity. Gilles Deleuze says cinema is a strange thing. Cinema is based on this general equivalence, on the possibility of recording each and everything with the same standardized procedure. And at the same time, it is also a medium that is different from, let's say, science, that is different from scientific films, in as much as it generates meaning. And this meaning comes about by capturing privileged instance. I'm going to read the passage from L'Image Mouvement, page 5-6. It's a longer quote. This cinema, nevertheless, seems to thrive on privileged instance. It is often said, and now he comes to, he's going to talk about a Soviet cinema, so Dziga Vertov, but mainly Sergei Eisenstein. And this starts on page 5 of his book. So I think it's quite crucial. He jumps from Bergson and Muybridge and chronophotography to Soviet cinema, and in particular to Eisenstein. Cinema seems to thrive on privileged instance. It is often said that Eisenstein extracted from movements or developments certain moments of crisis, which he made the subject of the cinema par excellence. This is precisely what he called the pathetic. He picks out peaks and shouts. He pushes scenes to the climax and brings them into collision. But this is definitely not an objection. Let us turn to the cinema's prehistory and to the famous example of how the horses gallop. This could only be dissected exactly by Marais' graphic recording and Muybridge's equidistant snapshots, which relate the organized whole of the canter to any point whatever. if the equidistant points are chosen well, one inevitably comes across remarkable occasions. That is, the moments when the horse has one hoof on the ground, then 3, 2, 1. These may be called privileged instants, but not in the sense of the poses or generalized postures which mark the gallop in the old forms. These instants have nothing in common with long exposures, and would even be formally impossible as long exposures. If these are privileged instants, it is as remarkable or singular points which belong to movement and not as the moments of actualization of a transcendent form. The meaning of the notion has completely changed. The privileged instants of Eisenstein or of any other director are still any instant whatsoever. To put it simply, the any instant whatever can be regular or singular, ordinary or remarkable. End of quote. So let's keep this in mind. Deleuze says the singular is opposed to the regular. Okay, so, and the singular is in itself a whatever, an any instant whatever. So the any instant whatever can be regular or singular. It can be ordinary or remarkable. Okay, so here we really have this equation. Deleuze is piecing together different elements to introduce his idea of the whatever singularity, of the singularité quelconque. He will then, later in the book, come to speak about Eisenstein's montage. And in particular, he's interested in the way Eisenstein reworks through dialectics in a very heterodox way, probably. And this dialectics will lead to what Eisenstein calls the pathetic or image, the image of pathos. This is particularly graspable in some of the edits he made in Battleship Potemkin or Potemkin from 1925. So there is the famous scene on the stairs in Odessa. So the monster, the mother and son are seen at the beginning of the scene. They are running down the stairs, and we see the Cossacks starting to shoot. We never see those faces. So Deleuze has a whole reflection of what faces means, and faceness and visageité, he calls it. We never see the faces of these Cossacks. They fire their guns. We see the boy going down, and it's quite an interesting appeal to spectators. We actually, as spectators, realize the child has been hit before the mother even realizes it. So it's an inclusion of the audience here. She keeps running, actually, a few steps before she realizes the child is no longer with her. What Deleuze says here is something about the close-up. Now, of course, it's a very provocative idea because the close-up is traditionally thought of as something that relates to the individual. So there's something highly individual about the close-up. Deleuze says the opposite. Deleuze says the close-up works against individuation. The close-up works towards effacing the individual's face. I quote Deleuze, the facial close-up is both the face and its effacement. And he adds, on page 103, the close-up does indeed suspend individuation. What's that supposed to mean? I think it makes sense when we have a look at what happens in the Potemkin movie. This is the scene with the mother in terror. Maybe this scene is, yeah. This is probably what Deleuze is thinking of. So when the mother recaptures the body of her dead son, this face somehow embodies the singular whatever. So it's a face that is not individual anymore. It's almost an impersonal face. It's an anonymous face. And you might notice how different it is from the face before. So it's a face that somehow embodies radical singularity, but this radical singularity cannot be tied to a particular person any longer. So that would be radical non-individuality, radical singularity. That is also a common condition of a body traversed through affect. I have to mention that this interpretation is not an interpretation that all Eisenstein film scholars in general have found particularly convincing. I don't have neither the time nor the expertise to go into this here, but suffice it to say that Deleuze had only access to maybe, I was told, 1/3 of Eisenstein's writings, and we don't know how much of his movies he has seen. My point here is not to discuss the pertinence of his Eisenstein interpretation, but I think what he has to say is valid or interesting, even if it doesn't capture Eisenstein's own intention fully. Generally, Eisenstein thought of faces as typas in Russian, as types, whose genericity might question that something that what he sees as Hollywood cinema's bourgeois insistence on individual countenances. Right? So typas is the typical visual appearance of a given social class, and when selecting the extras for his films, Eisenstein was attentive to finding such generic faces. So some of the film scholars who worked on this, you can find the catalogue edited by Elena Folkman and Marie Rebecki on the work on the extras for Que Viva Mexico, where we really see what he means by these types. And I want to have this kind of representative of this class and some other class, and this kind of type he's thinking of. Now, although all of this is probably quite central for Eisenstein, other scholars have also emphasized the lack of interest Eisenstein had in a face in and of itself. I'm referring to the work by Noah Steimatsky, Film Faces in particular. And Eisenstein, if anything, is interested in the face as if it were a body, treating it as an acrobatic playground and teasing out the inner dynamics between literal and figurative parts and wholes. Maybe another montage can be interesting here. So that's a montage from Battleship Potemkin, rather at the beginning. So what's happening here? We have the surgeon, the vessel surgeon, and he's the person who had declared that the meat can be eaten by the crew. Although, as you know, the meat was already had gone bad and killed parts of the crew, and he will be made responsible also for this choice, because of course he's representative of the Tsarist power. But the violence unleashed against the surgeon leads to what could be thought of as a sort of synecdochic proxy that works like passe pro toto, his glasses. So the doctor is shown twice, first in a close-up, and later all that remains of him is his pince-nez, his glasses. Eisenstein himself comments this choice in later text, where he explains, I quote, "This device consists of replacing the whole, the doctor, with a part, his pince-nez, which plays him. At the same time, it turns out that it plays that role with much greater emotional intensity than the whole the doctor could have done had he been merely shown a second time, end of quote. The formal reduction of the repetition, that is the substitution of the whole person with one of his material attributes, is meant to heighten the affective intensity for the viewers, with the pince-nez literally gripping the audience. Interestingly, however, this pince-nez will also come back at a later moment, the moment I've already referred to, on the Odessa stairs, and it will now take on a new quality. Maybe I should stay here for a moment. So through montage, Eisenstein takes the whatever moment to a new quality. The whole is no longer generalized unity, which subsumes single elements or parts into a larger totality, but works through what Eisenstein calls the new dialectics. As Deleuze paraphrases it, it is the interval that takes on a crucial new meaning. Rather than having two distinct elements united by a higher pre-given unity, the novel higher element emerges in the very interval through what Eisenstein also calls a montage of attractions. To Eisenstein, there is a definite law of structuring that should be understood as a principle of creativity and novelty. And a crucial reference text in order to understand this is his non-indifferent nature, available also in English, standard edition from 1987. If you want to check this, he explicitly excludes any type of structured intervals that do not work towards growth. So here again, we have the whatsoever, but Eisenstein saying the whatsoever is not sufficient. We have to think of the whatsoever, I'm now using Deleuze's word, that introduces novelty, growth, or the leap. According to Eisenstein, there are three kinds of intervals in movement that do not qualify as pathetic intervals that lead to qualitative metamorphosis. I'll maybe skip the details here for the sake of time. But what is interesting is that all he does here is to say there must be a jump, a leap from the quantitative to the qualitative, and the Hegelians among you will to them it will sound very familiar. So it's a rereading of Hegel's idea, and the question is, of course, how to produce this leap towards the qualitative. Interestingly, already in this mid-period text, Eisenstein says from quantity to quality should be defined as intensity. So he uses the word intensity. He also talks of ecstasis in a very literal etymological meaning. So ecstasis means stepping out of oneself. And stepping out of oneself is the very leap jump we're talking about. So the stepping out is the very thing that happens besides oneself. And stepping out of oneself is stepping into the void, into this blank space, into this interval that, of course, montage is based upon. This is how we also move to I think some of the things that happen in the Potemkin movement. So in this scene, we have all at once editing, shooting from different angles and putting the spectator amid the crowd. And reportedly, there was also a circus-trained acrobat who had a handheld camera attached to his waist. So two figures are important. There's an old woman, you see her, she's the one with the pince-nez, and a young student, both equipped with glasses. They see but can't act. And yet they foreshadow a revolution to come. The events in 1905 announced a new power to come, that of the proletariat, and the 1917 revolution, because of course we're talking about events that took place in 1905. The circular movement, that of the baby carriage, blends with the movie camera reel and what was the pars pro toto of an object attached to a single figure, the surgeon, at the beginning of the film, announces a new way of seeing that is shared by both the figures and the spectators. So this is maybe an interesting explanation of what goes on here, taken from non-indifferent nature. In all decisive compositional elements, we encounter a basic formula of the ecstatic everywhere. Ecstatic everywhere. This is Eisenstein. A leap beside oneself, which unavoidably becomes a leap into a new quality and most often encompasses a diapason leap into the opposite. this is Deleuze's way to rephrasing this. We move from the pathetic to the affective. So Deleuze prefers the word affect. And Deleuze says affects are fundamentally impersonal. I quote from Movement Image 98-99. The affect is impersonal and it is distinct from every individuated state of things. It is nonetheless singular. The affect is singular and can enter into singular combinations or conjunctions with other affects. The affect is indivisible and without parts, but the singular combination that it forms with other affects form in turn an indivisible quality, which will only be divided by changing qualitatively. So he calls this the individual term he has also used in his political thinking from the early 90s. So basically, I think we start to see why the moving image, and in particular the montage in Soviet cinema, takes such a crucial role. Deleuze is deeply anti-dialectic. He's an anti-dialectical thinker. He hates Hegel. But this is the moment where they somehow seem to meet on a given interest, where there's a dialectics that does not lead to new synthesis, or rather synthesis is thought of as a heterogenesis. So there's a synthesis that leads to heterogenesis rather than a synthesis that unifies the heterogeneous into the one. I could go about this at length, also refer to the fact that he, in other texts, draws on a theory of rhythms put forward by the phenomenologist Henri Maldinet, who defines rhythm through what he calls critical instance, instant critique, where intensive points are not those of a pre-existing structure, rhythmical patterns, but rather moments of an imminent divergence, such as tonic accents, points of unevenness, points of flexion. I'm saying this just to tell you this is where Deleuze is maybe at its most dialectical as it gets, and where he's maybe also very phenomenological in the sense of Husserlian phenomenology, where Maldinet, his own colleague at Lyon, introduces him to another kind of thinking of immanence, of experience. But all of this boils down to saying that to Deleuze, singularities are irreducible to any generalization. They are not something peculiar to human beings. They're not peculiar to anything that could be endowed with personhood. They are not, there's not something we could even associate with particulars. I think we've seen this. It runs through movements, moments, affects, and I think this is important to understand. In a certain sense, he says singularity are the true transcendental events. And this is what makes it so difficult to understand what he means by that. So it's his rephrasing of transcendental philosophy. However, I've only given you one entry point into his own thinking of singularity. Deleuze himself chose another one. And he said, if I started to use the concept of singularity, is because I've started to read one philosopher who introduced me to this concept. And this philosopher is Gilbert Simondon. I had the chance and opportunity to work closely with a friend and colleague who is an great expert on Deleuzean philosophy, Judith Michelet, and we have published this text in 2017, where we have spent a great deal of time in detail to clarify this entanglement. So understand why the concept of singularity is derived from Simondon, as Deleuze claims, why this is both true and not true, or rather what happens in this adaptation of Simondon's concept of singularity to Deleuze's thinking. Don't worry, I'm not going to repeat all these painstakingly detailed analyses. I'll be happy to share this text with you because it's all in there with much greater detail that I could improvise it here. I can at best try to summarize some of the conclusions in order for us to then engage in a discussion, because that's what I would like to move towards. So the few things I'd like to say about what Deleuze's reading of Simondon is that it discovers one of Simondon as being one of the greatest, in a way, metaphysicians of 20th century. And I think this is absolutely true. Maybe Simondon was the Whitehead of the second half of 20th century. And this is only slowly getting acknowledged. And Deleuze was probably one of the very few who understood that. The Opus Magnum by Simondon is now finally available in English too. It's his book on individuation, his doctoral thesis, actually. So it came out with Minneapolis Press in 2020. So anyone wanting to engage with that, I only invite you to read that book. It's really it's a masterpiece. What I want to say is that we find lots of occurrences of the concept of singularity in Simondon, but most importantly for our discussion here is that the singular is not the end point. It's not the starting point. It's not anything stable. It's not anything that results from any process, but rather, and this is where he diverges from Deleuze's own project, that sets a process into motion. And what is this process? It's the process of individuation. So Simondon is the philosopher who is interested in individuation. He's maybe even closer in his interest than Duns Scotus would be to Deleuze, I believe. So he really takes up some medieval questions of what individuation is, but he reformulates it in very radically new terms that would need to be explained step by step. There is no such thing within the cosmos, according to Simondon, like an order or a givenness. All there is metastability. So metastability is the prime condition for individuation. This is what he calls the pre-individual. So we have a milieu, and this milieu is defined through metastability. He also says that being is the not one, non-un. So he's definitely not a monist. On the other hand, it is not nothing either. It is what he says a non nullus, as Latins say, a not nothing. Now, as you know, in Latin, non nullus is both the not nothing and something, someone. And again, we have something very close to the idea of the whatever. So where we have something, someone, we have also some form of anonymity. But what? To begin with, nothing but the this, which exists by virtue of the thisness of being such, as medieval ontology refers to it, hexetas, as Duns Scotus, from hec, this thing. And the thisness is what is common to a thing, to a string of molecules, a patch of color, a sequoia tree, a wind, a state of intense joy, or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. There's a productive misunderstanding discussed by Deleuze in Simondon when Simondon translates heceitas as, in French, exeite. He writes it with E-C-C-E-I-T-E. So exeite is not the hec, the Latin, the this, but he translates this as ecce, as see here. And I think it's a remarkable misunderstanding because, if anything, it testifies a concern with the real, where singularity is not meant to be defined only negatively as that which is irreducibly non-generalizable or non-substitutable, as in some other post-structuralist philosophy of difference. It is meant to have an empirical thickness attested by the deictic particle ecce, this very body, this very event. Yet suchness is nothing that could be essentially stabilized, and as a matter of fact, there is no such thing as a single singularity, in the same fashion as there is not a multiple, there are only multiplicities. How does this come about then? Maybe it's useful to recall that Simondon took a crucial inspiration from crystallography. So individuation is thought in non-human terms, first of all. It's not even thought of in vitalist terms, as in Bergson. So we find with Simondon an account of individuation that starts with non-biocentric processes. I think this is very important to underscore. So he is Bergsonian in some way, but in other ways, he's also deeply an anti-vitalist. Maybe that's why I compared him to Whitehead. So if we want to understand how crystallography works, we thus take a watery solution, particular environment that needs to be at a specific temperature to enable rapid spread. So the environment can be neither too rigid nor too slack, neither chaotic nor fully stabilized. And in this solution, in this milieu, in this environment, there will be the supervenience of what Simondon calls the singularité. It's a germ, and this germ is a foreign element, a foreign agent. This is what he means by singularité. So if you have this half-stable, metastable aqueous solution, for example, there's an introduction of a germ, of a foreign element, of a foreign agent, if you wish, and this foreign agent will set the process of crystallization into motion. Only by the introduction of this external element, the process of the crystallization will start. What happens is the thing you see on these photos here. So there's a formation of a structure that can be generalized. The introduction of a foreign body will eventually catalyze the process of crystallization around this initial germ or seed, and the microscopic structure will propagate until it has then organized the entire environment. The crystal seed, therefore, is both also known as seed in crystallography, making it singular, and a microscope would reveal the preformation to be highly organized to the extent that it anticipates the entire structure. The singular seed, the appearance of which remains spontaneous and to this day inexplicable, writes Simondon, introduces within the amorphous environment an element of asymmetry that polarizes it and imprints a form upon it, thereby literally informing it. Information theory. The transmission of this information to the entire metastable environment is what Simondon calls, and that's maybe his most crucial invention in his philosophy, transduction, a process that is interminable. I quote, "The phenomenon of growth is consequently automatic and indefinite. All the subsequent layers of crystal have the ability to structure amorphous environment surrounding them, so long as this environment remains metastable. In this sense, a crystal is endowed with an infinite power of growth. A crystal's growth may be stopped, but never finished." This is the starting point of what Deleuze does in his masterpiece oeuvre, Individuation, to explain what processes of individuation owe to singularity. To make this one thing clear, and I'll stop there so that we can spend the other half of the session for discussion. Singularité is not identical, of course, with individuality. Le singulier is not individual, firstly. Secondly, the singular is not simply something that replaces individuality as the result of the whole process by introducing features such as eeriness, peculiarity, etc., etc. Thirdly, singularity in Simondon is not what belongs to individuation as its outcome, but rather as the seed that sets it into motion. And lastly, this is the point where Deleuze and Simondon disagree, because to Simondon, the pre-individual metastable initial condition of the pre-individual lacks singularities. Whereas to Deleuze, who combines, let's say, a form of structuralism of difference with a form of transcendental empiricism, the virtual field is the field that already contains singularities that can then be actualized. So this is probably the difference where also Simondon is being criticized by Deleuze as well. To Deleuze, there is a sort of virginality of this pre-individual that Deleuze does not agree with. And he makes a lot of adaptation of Simondon's concept of singularity, which I could go about at length if you want me to, but maybe it'd be nicer to stop here and to insist upon this, I think, very peculiar genealogy that comes from Bergson, that comes from Simondon, and to Deleuze, whereby explaining an invention of a new kind of singularity that is aimed at producing a new explanation of individuation for Simondon in this process of expansive transduction, and for Deleuze it explains something else, which we could also call intensive difference, which is a new theory of the transcendental in a certain way. So I'll finish off with this quotation by Simondon. Everything happens as if metastable equilibrium could only be disrupted by the local deposit of a singularity contained in a crystalline germ that can disrupt this metastable equilibrium. Once it has been initiated, the transformation propagates for the action that is exerted at the start between crystalline germ and the metastable body is then exerted gradually between the transformed parts and the parts that are not yet transformed. So as you see, from this crystalline condition, we will then move to vital processes. We will move to animated bodies. We'll move to human bodies, collectives. We can even think of revolutions. Simondon has a theory of revolution even. Of course, the same applies to technical machines, of how technical evolution happens. So we're definitely in a non-vitalist environment, where Deleuze is probably himself located in a much more vitalist, albeit critical vitalist environment. But I'll maybe stop here and hope that I can clarify further points if you have questions. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Well, thank you, Emmanuel, for this very, very dense and intense contribution, which really adds up a whole new layer to our ongoing discussion on singularity. So many thanks. There will be so much to discuss. Maybe just two references before opening the discussion to what we've been saying in the previous sessions. 2 points that are really interesting, maybe also to put you up to date. We've been starting by saying that when we speak about singularity, something that that is very, very interesting is also to ask a simple question: what is the opposite of singularity? What is the opposite of singular? And maybe two answers are possible. So usually you think we think of singularity as opposed to universality, or as opposed to plurality. And maybe these are also two different accounts, a vertical and a horizontal account of singularity. And I believe by discussing the problem of the one or of the universal, maybe we focus on the vertical hierarchical level. And today, maybe you have highlighted the other way. So this tension between singular and plural, and which maybe accounts for a more horizontal way of thinking about singularity. And another thing, maybe etymological, that really interests me is that last time Saloni de Souza, who was not here, unfortunately, started out by remarking that there is no word for singular in ancient Greek. So it is very difficult to understand what is the ancient Greek word for singularity. And she proposed hen. So she proposed the one. And we had a little exchange on that, because I always thought that the most most natural choice was actually ekaston, so ta ekasta, which is precisely what is translated in whatever, in anything. So it is it's very striking that you put the accent on, that you highlight this reference to quiconque, to whatever, to the anyness of singularity. So that's just to remark that there is, even though your contribution really steps into a completely different domain, there is some continuity in the things we've been discussing so far. So I've spoken too much. I'm more than happy to open the discussion. Please, if you have any questions, make yourself visible. Either raise your hand or write to us in the chat. Please let us know you want you'd like to speak. Francesco, yeah, please go on.
Thanks, Alessandro. So, first of all, thanks for Professor Alloa for your presentation, so clear, so precise. And so I have too much question to stress. As anticipated, I wrote about Deleuze, Simondon, Jean-Ducot. Well, just to underline some point, firstly is about the second picture of Arbor Porfiriana you showed before, just to point out some resonance on the semantic problem of singularity. If you see at the end of the tree, there is not individuum, there is individua. That's plural. So even in this Aristotelian or Neoplatonic, depends on what you want to think about Arbor Porfiriana. But in the Aristotelian tradition, you cannot think about the singular, but you just think about the plurality of individuum according to a general category. So what's the opposite? Is individua opposite to substantia, for example? No, it's not opposite, it's not the contradictory, but the dialectical, something that participates to. So just a point, very interesting, I'd like to underline. The second point, I just appreciate to starting the discussion about singularity, individuality in Deleuze, beginning from the cinema, because just an element that I never focus about. When Deleuze try to describe the problem of singularity in difference and repetition, différence et répétition, utilizes a lot of semiotical dictionary, or in general a structuralist dictionary. So, for example, the problem of univocity is just one voice for everything. Even the following text, Logique du sens, is about the problem of sense. So it's something that you can think, it's something that starts from the languages. But if you start from the point of view of cinema, you have not that problem. Deleuze want to think about the problem of singularity and the sens, not through linguistic, and the cinema is the medium to show that problem. So there is not the sense now is the affectivity, the impersonal affectivity. But I think it's the point I would like to stress. I have a question. I think it's a research topic for a PhD or a paper. I don't know. Deleuze, as you underlined, Deleuze is so critical about the relevance of pre-individual in Simondon, because there is the risk of the preeminence of this common nature on the singular. The same critics is moved against Jean-Ducot and say, no, I want to think about this process, the individuality as a process. There is not the principium, the principle of individuation, but the process of individuation. But if we move in the text in the late 70s, starting from the Négociation written with Claire Parkney, Duns Scott, Simondon, and Deleuze get one single voice, and they say the same thing. So the question is, why Deleuze take again Simondon without the critique of the preeminence of natura comune, of the pre-individual, and he uses Simondon through Duns Scott. There is this question. There is another question beyond Simondon, is linked with Jean-Luc Nancy. In the 90s, Nancy and Agamben writes a lot against Duns Scotus, but I think is some critics against Simondon. They move the same critique of Deleuze, but their aim, their objective is to think the individuality without or beyond the natura communis, with some political problem that they are linked with. And Agamben and Nancy uses the same term of the same word of Deleuze, la quelconque, whatsoever. I don't know, the English translator decided to translate this word. So why after the 90s there is a lot such a hate against Simondon and Duns Scott? That's my question. That is two questions.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you. To begin with, concerning these two engravings, of course, you're right. The individual is already in the plural on the right engraving. It's not the case on the left. So on the left, we have the homo, and homo is, of course, always the singulare tantum. We have the individua, but as you will have noted, there is also very peculiar iconography. So we have Saint John, Saint Peter, Saint John on the left, announcing something. We have Saint Peter on the right, that will be quite fundamental for setting up something like an institution of that is related to the eschatology. But then we have this middle figure, and this middle figure is nothing but Adam, no one but Adam. So Adam, that appears twice. Adam appears with the snake, and Adam appears as the skull at the bottom of the tree. So as we all know, if we're familiar with Christian iconography, this also foreshadows something else. The descendants of this human species are the descendants of Adam. That is, the descendants that of course live in guilt, and what their guilt will be subsumed by a new figure, and that is, of course, the humanization of God through the figure of Christ. And at the bottom of the cross, we will see this very skull again in the Christian iconography that reminds us of this ascendance to Adam. So somehow I will say, yes, there is a pluralization. There are three and more, but all of them are somehow subsumed by the one figure, that is that of Adam at the beginning, and that anticipates the one figure to come, that of Christ. So yes, a certain pluralization, but in a way, I think unity is at the beginning and unity is at the end. Now, your point is very, very interesting. I have to say, I have not probably read these dialogues with Claire Parkney as attentively as you have, simply because you were looking for some references to Duns Scotus. This had escaped me. I have to think about it. Yeah, I will read them again. In what respect one could say that these are actually critiques of Simondon. Let's not forget, however, that Simondon was not a shared reference in the intellectual space. So he passed away in 1990. I don't know if this is the moment where the book had already, L'Individuation had already been republished when Deleuze and Claire Parnay discussed. I don't know, maybe. I would have to check about the months we're talking about. Agamben probably started reading that in the moment this huge book was republished. But if we talk about the 80s, I really don't think Jean-Luc Nancy had any important got any important influence from Simondon. So I would highly doubt there was such a hidden subtext earlier on and hiding behind Duns Scotus, where in fact they were criticizing Simondon. It doesn't seem that plausible, but I might be wrong because, of course, I'm maybe less aware of these constellations that other people might be. But I'll look it up. Thank you. And as to Agamben, yeah, you might know more about this than I do, and how much and when he started integrating Simondon into his own thinking. You'll tell me. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco, and thank you, Emmanuel. Stephanie Koch has a question, so please go on.
Yeah, hi, and thanks a lot for the presentation. I've got two questions. One, Simondon, the other one, Deleuze. But they're kind of intertwined, I guess. So, okay, starting from Simondon, it was something that you said which really clicked with a problem I've been having. So I've read bits and pieces mostly, and yes, you can't hear me.
It's very distorted. So I don't know whether Emmanuel has the same problem. I mean, we can hear you, but
okay.
It's rather much. So maybe you can try. Maybe you can try and put your
I can try this.
Yes, this is definitely better.
Okay, sorry, I'm just at a cafe because I'm on vacation, but I didn't want to miss the talk. So yeah, okay. So as I was saying, Simondon, I've been having this problem. I've only read bits and pieces, so I might be wrong, but it really clicked with something that you said about singularity being the point introduced, being the element introduced to the pre-individual that sets crystallization of. And that was kind of my problem in different terms, that it felt like it was quite mystical how exactly crystallization was being set off, because you had this pre-individual and then it kind of started. And now that that was the missing piece, the something that is introduced, but it kind of feels like this something is already an individual. So it comes from outside. It does not stem from the pre-individual and the meta-stability, the metastable everything that is the universe. So it kind of feels to me like it is a vicious circle. I don't know if that's the exact critique that Deleuze does, but it feels like he already assumes an individual, that he makes a point of singularity, that's the le singulier, that then sets off individuation. So that was kind of my concern with Simondon. And then with Deleuze, it's really quick. So I'll just say that too, ask that too, actually. You said that for Deleuze, the virtual has singularities, with which I totally agree, but I would just like to ask if you think we could take it a step further, because it feels like the virtual is singularities, like the way I understand pure difference for Deleuze is like singularity. So it's just that, and it cannot be reproduced. I mean, he has this whole thing with repetition, but it's a very different repetition, apparently. So I was thinking that, les multiplicités, la différence pure, it is like singularity. Yeah. So yeah, these are my two questions. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, I can share your concerns. I mean, in this article I referred to, co-authored with Judith Michelet, we really explain how Deleuze uses rather different references from mathematics. Albert Lotman, in particular, topology is very crucial. He also makes use of some concepts from physics that Simondon does not use, and structuralism, of course. And then he ends up with statements, especially in these very late texts from 1990. I'm thinking of the dialogues with Claire Parnet, where he seems to say not altogether different things, but where he seems to be very far away from the initial discussion with Simondon. So when he says, I'm just quoting here, the actualization of the virtual is singularity. So that, of course, would put singularity not so much on the kind of transcendental field, but on the level of actualization. Then he says things like singularities. Sorry, we can speak of events only as singularity is deployed in a problematic field. So introduces this whole thing of the fact that the field itself is defined through the problematic. I don't think that what is most troubling to Deleuze is the fact that Simondon needs something like an individuated seed. So I don't think this is the most troubling element, because the singularité doesn't need to be individuated at all. It's just something that somehow kicks the whole thing, is a Kickstarter. So the Kickstarter is in a way defined functionally and does not exist in and of itself, which is, of course, the traditional understanding of anything like individualities. Individuality is the irreducible thing that is not subordinated to anything else. And of course, if you define the initial seed as a pure functional Kickstarter, then of course the traditional understanding of individuality falls short. So I think he's more concerned with this virginality of the state. So this meta-stability that somehow contains no singularity, and how does the singularity come in? Where does it come from? I think that's more his concern than saying that singularity needs to be individuated, which I think is not a necessary condition for Simondon's theory of the singulier. Now, what are we to make of these affirmations about the pure differences? I mean, Deleuze is a difficult author to engage with, because of course he's playing on references. There are Platonic elements, there are structuralist elements, there are elements that he takes from Peirce and linguistics. There are elements he takes from very different contexts from Bergson. So what are we talking about? Which Deleuze are we talking about? What is the aim? So I think Deleuze is insisting on the fact that we have problems we have to deal with. And I think it's not useful to discuss Deleuze in such general ways. So he's engaging with a problem. He tries to solve, or maybe solving is not the right word, but he tries to engage with a certain problematic field. That it can be cinema, it can be Francis Bacon's painting, it can be a certain situation, political situation of late modern society, which he defines through this individual state of controlled societies, etc. So I think it's more useful to look at what Deleuze is doing rather than trying to reconstruct some sort of general grand theory at the background, which can then be applied, because I don't think that's the way he works. But I can understand that it's puzzling to anyone trained in more traditional philosophy, and I'm definitely the first one to be puzzled. So I've spent many years trying to wrap my hand around Deleuze, and the reason being because I did not understand him. So I have no pretense to be any closer to understanding today, but all I can say is that I spent many hours in trying to understand what he was trying to say, and I can certainly say what he's not doing, or what I did not find a useful way to engaging with his philosophy. So that's probably not a useful answer at all to your worries, and I'm sorry if this comes as a disappointing answer.
It helps a lot. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephanie. And is there any other other questions? Yes, Greg, please go on.
Thank you very much. You can hear me all right? Okay, I had some trouble before. Okay. Yeah, thanks so much for your talk. It's very interesting, very rich. I am not a Deleuze reader, so please excuse any inaccuracies in my representation of the views. But I'd like to pursue a thought, and I'm curious. How you might imagine Deleuze responding, and also I'm hoping that my question will be illuminating maybe for others who are not as deeply immersed in the text as you are. So my question is about this any instance whatever, and I'm thinking about the concept of the singularity in connection with this any instance whatever. So when I think about the any instance whatever, I imagine, say, going into a classroom and you're going to pick any of the students, whatever. They're all instances of the concept student, or they're all humans, and you pick any one of them. Any instance, whatever will do. Any instance, whatever, there's a kind of indifference here. There's a Gleichgültigkeit. There's a kind of something unremarkable. One will do just as well as the other. In this way, it doesn't matter which one you pick, right? So there's a universal. It has instances and particulars, and it doesn't matter which one you pick. They will all function equally as an instance of the same kind. Pick any one, any instance, whatever. So when I think about this any instance, whatever, this way, or any whatever, then my first thought is here, it makes sense to think about, say, the regular version of this. As you said, we have you made this distinction between the regular and then the remarkable, right? So there's the singular any instance, whatever, and the regular one. So right away, I can see this regular, ordinary, maybe non-singular in the sense of remarkable, any instance, whatever. But then my question comes, well, what exactly is the singular any instance, whatever? What is the remarkable moment when, given the conceptual analysis that we just performed, the regular seems to be the more obvious conceptual content connected to that idea? And then my thought comes, well, isn't it something, maybe this is too close to some kind of post-structurals, an interruption, an interruption of the any instance, whatever. So this is where I go next, an interruption, displacing of the any instance, whatever. And shouldn't the singular be something like an interruption of that rather than say a kind of any instance, whatever? Okay, so that's my first, and then there's a couple. This is, say, the moment of the foreign that you, of course, you brought that in the discussion of Simondon, not of Deleuze, right? The foreign, or maybe the novel being something which indeed is remarkable exactly because it stands out, or exactly because it is not replaceable. But there was another concept that so that's my first question, is why, maybe just from a philosophical point of view, someone who's not immersed in these texts, you can help me kind of see why it is that Deleuze, and maybe he does in other places, I'm just interested in this, why maybe the language of interruption, or if this of interrupting the any instance, whatever, rather than, say, thinking about the singular as in continuity with that notion. That's my first question. And then the second question is connected to the notion of ecstasis, which I was very interested in the way Deleuze uses it, because of course it's there in Heidegger and there in Sartre, and it's there in Schelling, and there's this idea of this self-transcending that's there in many other authors going back, also in the German tradition and such. I'm inclined then to think about singularity, any instance, whatever, that's singular or remarkable, in terms of a kind of any instance, whatever, that in fact is not any instance, whatever, that in fact is something remarkable. That is to say, the very negation of the unremarkable regularity of, say, the indifferent particularity that constitutes this kind of regular any instance, whatever. Where then you could have the singular any instance, whatever, would be a kind of self-negation or self-overcoming of, say, the regular, or the universal particular axis. That may be too Hegelian, that may be too dialectical, and there's this opposition, as you mentioned, between Deleuze and Hegel, so that may not be a path he's interested in taking. But I'm just curious about how this notion of the ecstasis and self-transcendence fits into that discourse. So thanks so much. I hope the questions made some sense. Oh, you're muted now, sorry.
You're muted, yeah.
Yes, absolutely, it makes sense. Though I might suspect that some true Deleuzians, unlike me, would probably say it's absolutely unacceptable to try to sneak in some ideas from German idealism and from romanticism or existentialism, because Deleuze is not a thinker of interruption in the same way as some, let's say, Schellingian tradition might have it, and he would probably not use the word ecstasis either. So that's Eisenstein. Okay, so what he uses is intensity, not ecstasis. So both share the insistence of intensity, but the leap forward, which of course he takes from Eisenstein's own reading of Lenin and Hegel, which is already quite peculiar, is not something he wants to go into. So of course, Deleuze fashions himself as an anti-dialectical thinker, and there would be much to say about the deep entrenched anti-Hegelianism of French philosophy in the 1960s. I devoted a lecture course to this a year ago, so it's quite fascinating. And I think it's really a generational thing to say, okay, the existentialists all discovered who they were by reading Hegel, so now we're just all going to be anti-Hegelians. I think a more subtle reading might bring about more interesting elements here. I was trying to indicate why the leap from quantitative to qualitative is actually based on this idea of intensity, and the intensity is something that cannot be divided without changing nature. So I think this is really the key. So this could maybe be something we can explore. You asked me about how so picking a singular instance might actually counter the radical equality of all these instances. I think that's, of course, the most tricky part. So if you tell me, okay, all you students in class are instances of your class students, then you can simply pick any of those, and it will be indifferent who you pick to discuss a point. I think it would be useful to distinguish between indifference and equivalence. So Gleichgültigkeit is not the same thing as indifference. So it makes a difference. But what is related here is the equivalence or equivalence. So it's gleichgültig. They're all have the same value and have the same power or something like that. And of course, for a reading of the filmmaker like Eisenstein, it's quite easily understandable why we would say there is no difference between the student and the old woman, although they are radically different. And to a filmmaker, to any artist, it's quite obvious that it makes a difference who you pick. So we're not talking about numbers, we're talking about embodiments, we're talking about figures, we're talking about picking this body and not another body, picking this figure, picking this. So of course it makes a difference. But the whole point is to say, well, this mother, the thisness, also is equivalent to all mothers, and all mothers are equivalent to maybe all bodies capable of being affected, you know, and that's the point. So there's a general equivalent that runs against some form of numeric equivalence, because it's this body capable of affect that relates to all other bodies of affect. So there's a leap towards all other bodies that are, in a very Spinozian sense, capable of being affected. And to a filmmaker, it's quite obvious. So it's not just going to be an abstraction. It's going to be someone you film, and it's going to be this mother. It's the thisness of this mother, of this face, and yet it's anonymous in the sense that it's a condition that is probably related to all other conditions of bodies capable of affect. Now, at some point, and I wasn't sure if it was a lapsus or a deliberate, you said the any instance whatsoever rather than the any instant whatsoever. And of course, I think both Simondon and Deleuze would refrain from using any vocabulary, any semantics of instantiation, because instantiation it derives from some form of pre-existing category or pre-existing being that is then being instantiated. So the any instant is the moment of the temporality that cannot be tied back to any form of general being or category that pre-exists it. So I think the vocabulary of instantiation is probably something they would resist to. Another way to go would probably be, since the name George Agamben was brought up, is mannerism. So there are some very interesting developments today. Maybe you could even invite some of those. I'm thinking of the work by Sjoerd van Teunen, a Dutch philosopher, art historian, who's taking Agamben's reading of these things a step further when saying what mannerism calls maniera is the mode of being, and the mode of being moves beyond the couple of the individual existence and the universal essence, right? Because it also moves beyond the mechanism of species and genus. The maneria is something that is deeply anti-Platonic. So anti-Platonic means there is an idea and its instantiations. And for a long time, art was obsessed with this Platonic ideal that we have. The artist has an idea in her mind and somehow instantiates this idea. Whereas mannerism says, well, no, there is something like style. There's a stylization. So stylization replaces idealization, insisting on inventivity. So there is an immanent norm somehow, and the artist is playing on variations on what is taken to immanent norm. But by playing on these variations, it also makes this norm visible that maybe hadn't been visualized before. So it's not something peculiar to the 17th century, but maybe modern art is more mannerist than any manierismo of the 17th century. And so, yeah, this is something that Agamben develops in a chapter from the Coming Community in 1990 again, interestingly. But then, Sean Van Teunen and other people have taken this into very interesting developments today as to what that might mean in terms of being attentive. It's a form of modal ontology, if you wish, but it's a modal ontology that starts with the manner and not with individual instances or tokens. Yeah.
And maybe I could just briefly follow up, just maybe also conceptual clarification.
Yeah.
So any instant whatever for Deleuze, for example, wouldn't imply that there's the instances themselves are not instantiations. Because any instant whatever already seems to, again, this is maybe because I'm again thinking from the outside, so
Yeah.
is that there is there are instances, and there are any of them. So here you seem to have an implication already of the say instance, the concept of instance that's particularized in any of them. What I mean is that it seems to already be implying instantiation and universality, and there seem to be implied in the very concept already. So this one, is there a problem there, or is this just not a problem at all? That the instance, this language of the any instant, any instant, whatever.
Yeah, I wouldn't overstate the importance of the instant, because that's really only because Deleuze is discussing philosophies of time within his book on cinema. But what he's insisting on is singularity, whatever singularity, singularité quelconque. So a moment can be whatever singularity, an affect can be a face can be a singularity, whatever singularity. So that's the point. So they're all singularities. It can be a gust of wind, it can be a patch of color, it can be a rhyme, a note played by a jazz player. All of these are singularities, and there are certainly not instances nor instantiations of anything that could precede it. Yeah. So there are lots of other problems once you start with a philosophy of immanence, because all of these are philosophies of immanence. So there are lots of other problems that they come up with, but they get rid of this kind of model. Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Greg. And so is there any other question? Because if there aren't, I do have some more questions. So please make yourself visible.
Yeah, yes, thanks for this reference, this book, Philosophy of Mannerism. Yeah.
Yeah, just I took the liberty so that because it's really a great contribution. And I do have many questions, but we will have time to discuss later on. I do have one question that maybe could also have a discussion a little bit. I'm sorry to make you do that, but can you go back to the Porphyrian tree? Because Francisco has underlined an element which was interesting, but maybe there is another one that can be interesting. So basically, I was not. What I find striking is not the fact that there are individua, namely that, so to say, individua are plurals, but rather that there is an illustration for every concept in this tree. But when you have to illustrate instantiations of the universals in the branches, you use words. So cellum, substantia, homo, etc., etc. I wonder, because there are other versions of this tree where at the very bottom you find Petrus et Paulus, for instance. So as an instantiation of the individua, you find proper names, so to say. In this case, I find it interesting that there seems to be an asymmetry in the fact that the instantiations of individua are not names, are not written words, but rather images, so to say. So I wonder whether that can play some sort of part in underlying a fundamental asymmetry, because this is a huge problem. Namely, so Aristotle's philosophy tells us that, of course, you cannot, it's not a continuum, so to say. So you cannot just divide species and come to and arrive and get the individual, so to say. So there is a step. There is some sort of jump, some sort of discontinuity between universals and the individual. And this is something I think that you find throughout philosophy. Also in Hegel science of logic, for instance, something I find very interesting is that you have, so to say, when in the part about in section on the concept, you have universality, particularity, and then you have the singular. You don't have singularity. You have the singular, which is something very puzzling that somehow some interpreters have tried to understand as a way of underlining this continuity. So something happens. And what I wonder, I come to the question, sorry. So the first question is, can it be interesting that, so to say, images and not words are used in order to illustrate individuals? But the second question is, the problem of ekatas and the problem of individuation, isn't it possible to understand all these theories as different ways of solving the problem of plurivocity or univocity of being? Namely, the problem that, in a way, if you endorse a univocal understanding of being, you somehow have to explain why talking about, I don't know, Emmanuel is not the same than talking about concepts or universal. So you still have to account for this fundamental discontinuity between something singular and something that is, so to say, not singular. That's, I don't know, it's very generic as a question, but I mean, I was always wondering, I don't know, Bertrand Russell says we have the being can mean two different things. So it can mean identity, it can mean attribution, so to say. But if you have a univocal understanding of being, you still have to come up with a way to address the problem of how things become individuals, so to say. And maybe I wonder whether we are discussing different solutions to the same problem.
Yeah. I mean, the easiest way out is to say, in this engraving on the right, we do not have a jump between words to images, but we have a jump from words to a compound of images and words. Because if you look carefully, you will see that all of these singulars, if you want to call them the way, have both a visual appearance and a name tag somehow. Of course, there's a difference between John and Peter and Adam, because these are proper names. And then we have two animals, right and left. So on the left, we have Ovis, we have this sheep, and on the right, we have Gallus. So of course, these are generic names. These are not proper names. They're not naming this this animal. They're naming a genus, you know. So yes and no. I think we'll have to look into this. But your question is, of course, broader and goes beyond these engravings, because there are lots of diagrams. I mean, I could go about this at length. I find it fascinating, and not all of them are in tree form. So we have circular models and other ones. I think we need to introduce other concepts. So I myself work with the distinction that I take from, let's say, Paul Ricoeur, among others, the idem ipse distinction. So I think this is something we need. So there is identity in the sense of the idem, and there is an identity of the sense of ipseity. So I would think we need to be able to talk about this quality of red, and we need to be able to talk about this animal, about this friend, about this human being, about this frog, and I think, yeah, these are, of course, distinctions that we will not find in the tradition I was referring to right now. But yeah, I don't think it makes sense to talk of a patch of color as an ipse, you know. So I believe that there are modes of being that have some form of relationship to themselves. I would probably say that some arts are capable of this self-relationship. So, as you know, I'm claiming that images are spaces for thinking. Arts relate to themselves. Music can comment upon itself, can be commentary on what music is, etc. So I believe that there's some form of self-reflexivity, but I still think that we need a distinction between idem and ipse, and that a mere deictical definition of being is of course not enough. And yeah, so maybe that would be my spontaneous response here.
Yeah, thank you. So we are at the end of our time. Again, many thanks, Emmanuel, for this great contribution to our seminar series. We have discussed about many things, many new things, and I just remind you all that we will take a break now for summer, and the next meeting is with Francesco Di Maio, so we will go on with Gilles Deleuze and with Scotus probably the 27th of September. So again, thank you so much for to Emmanuel, to you all for your participation, and we wish you a great day or a great night, depending on where you are.
Thanks so much.
Thanks to you. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.